And for this next session, that's one of the things that Katie and I really committed to, is that our work is your work. Our work is the growing of an many to many partnership of an ecosystem that's flourishing together. We're deeply devoted to your work. That's our work. And within that, showcasing your work and kind of all of these incredible efforts that are happening, we also have bits and baubles of things that we're emerging and launching through the Open Future Coalition. So this morning is an opportunity for both. We will be sharing a model, a demonstration model for direct funding and regenerative financing to local community stewardship of restoration efforts, and in partnership with Puente and Treeangle, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But we've also invited a few folks from the IMD Fund. Miriam, Volat, I see you here. Nice to have you with us. And Angela Martinez from the Amazon Defenders Fund. Very honored to also hear who else is doing this incredibly important work right now. Before we kick off this particular session, I am going to thank those convening partners I named earlier. Again, this incredibly rich nexus. So I want to thank the American Sustainable Business Network, Bluefin Investment, Eco Restoration Alliance. Many of you are here. We've been an ongoing partner, and today especially was inspired by our work with you. El Puente, Global Unity, Guild of Future Architects, thank you for co-hosting this with us and helping us kick off the mornings each day. Heartland P5, Imagine World, Institute of Ecotechnics, I see some of you here, thank you. Intergen Family, Kinship Earth, the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, who is a recent partner for our newly launched National Center for Regenerative Extension. Partnerships for Change, Pro-Social World, Reconsider, Toxic Free Futures for Our Children, the Treeangle Foundation, who we'll be hearing from momentarily, and United Refuge. Again, many of you are our partners, and we just thank you so wholeheartedly for your ongoing devotion to this incredible body of work. And we're excited to mutually uplift together. And with that, I am going to officially offer the floor to those who will be sharing a bit about the model today. Again, this session is focused on examining models for local stewardship that are directly implied in funding ecological restoration, and particularly focused on direct financing to those stewards, Indigenous stewards, stewards of place, and local community members who traditionally, there's billions of dollars pouring into this concept of climate action and restoration, and yet so little of it touches the ground. The numbers are staggering, actually. The percentage of this giant wealth pool that's supposedly being pledged and poured into a very urgent moment where we need to act responsibly, we need to act wisely and effectively and cooperatively. And yet so little of those resources are actually touching the ground in the communities who are the land defenders, who are the front line of ensuring the biodiversity of the planet, who are doing the work of restoration and repair, and who've long been the stewards of place, who never destroyed forests in the first place, or if they did, it was only through external incentivized forces to make the kind of change for a system that doesn't represent them, nor does it support or uplift or honor their sovereignty, their rights, doesn't recognize their wisdom and their right sovereignty as keepers of place and caretakers of place. So a lot of the work I'm doing in several versions of the work I do, some of it is with our Open Future Coalition work, and some of it is with If Not Us and Who. And a lot of you here we've invited from that group. But just to say, a common conversation happening is that the Indigenous are climate solutions, and local land stewards and local community members and those on the ground doing the work, they are the climate solution. And so whatever it is that's happening in halls of power that's continuing to perpetuate corporate interests and continue to make a lot of people very wealthy by extracting the planet and looking like it's doing good, but it's continuing to greenwash and extract and continue to perpetuate. The real answer is putting money, support, resources, sovereignty back into communities of place that are doing this work on the ground. So with that, I would love to open up and first invite, I think we're going to invite Amanda first. Is that right, Katie, to share a bit about the work that we're doing in, we're in partnership with El Puente. We'll go for Pablo Friedlander next with Treeangle Foundation, and then Katie with obviously our Open Future Fund. This is sort of a three-part, we're in partnership together. But I would love, Amanda, if you would introduce yourself and open us up with your work with El Puente. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jamaica, Katie, for an open future, for inviting us to come and speak with you all. It's really a pleasure to see some faces as well that I have met in the past. My name is Amanda, and I am one of the directors of El Puente Foundation. I also work alongside Pablo Friedlander very closely on El Puente. So I'll give just a little bit of an overview of what El Puente is, a bit of our 4 pillars or our ways of seeing the space. And then we will, I'll discuss a little bit of the pilot project and bring in Pablo to help weave in our collaborations and how we're all working together. So El Puente, we essentially, it's a bridge of the wisdom and traditions of originary and First Nations peoples with the modern technologies of psychedelics. So as Jamaica has very aptly discussed in this introduction, one of the consequences of the emergent psychedelic renaissance, as we call it, is the unequal distribution of its benefits to the indigenous communities that have stewarded some of these plant medicines for quite a long time. And at Puente, we're creating a model of reciprocity and regeneration for the psychedelic sector by facilitating access and benefit sharing with indigenous communities. And this begins with participatory planning and reparations, since we need to begin with reparations before committing to any concept of reciprocity. And it's followed by making grants and investments into Indigenous owned and operated projects that promote biocultural preservation, ecological restoration of endangered ecosystems, environmental education programs, and sustainability initiatives to create resilient communities. And I would also add that part of our commitment to bringing this indigenous knowledge with the wisdom, bridging this knowledge with the wisdom of the future, is a recognition of the complexity and sensitivity of this mission. And so rather than proceeding under the sort of colonial approach of philanthropy, where we're imprinting our own solutions, we're actually choosing to listen before we're being guided towards any actions in co-creation with indigenous groups. So we have, El Puente has essentially 4 pillars: sovereignty, education, regeneration, and reciprocity. And I'll just give a really quick overview of those. With sovereignty, so El Puente, we promote indigenous sovereignty and inclusion through its beneficiaries and community. And this pillar is about the recognition of indigenous rights and territories beyond our colonial conception of inclusion, and instead acknowledges the indigenous rights to self-determination. So in practice, for our projects, El Puente is developing a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process, and that includes implementing long-term agreements with people and organizations working on the ground to support the needed recovery of indigenous lands, languages, and systems. And with education, El Puente, we support the systems of knowledge transfer and the sharing of best practices between bioregion, community, and organization. And this includes training, certification, and other educational tools on bioculture regeneration, and through different events and workshops. And through our partnerships with the likes of Academia Biosférica, we're enabling the qualification of local stakeholders to scale up existing projects in their bioregions while maintaining a database of knowledge and metrics to support the success of these projects. With regeneration, so El Puente, we're connecting, promoting, and sponsoring regenerative projects for ecological restoration, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, large-scale native trees reforestation, and other forms of intercultural eco-development. And this includes the creation of ethnobotanicals reserves, which is our key model for the synergistic application of all 4 of our pillars for the benefit of indigenous communities and their ecosystems. And this is something that Pablo will also speak with regards to Treeangle Foundation. Our last pillar is reciprocity. So we're developing a new model of exchange that amplifies local businesses and distributes resources to projects directed by and owned by indigenous communities. For example, we're facilitating the distribution of regenerative products and services coming from a community's restored ethnobotanicals reserves. And these returns, they're multifaceted. So they include not just financial returns, but also increased biodiversity and the formation of integrated working teams of Indigenous leaders, local stakeholders, and research institutions, all working together to create self-sustainability within these communities themselves, and of course, generating resilience and hope for the future of this planet. As Jamaica wisely said, the Indigenous are the climate solution. So we have a bit of, I don't know if Katie or Jamaica, I can share my screen.
Yes.
Yes, okay, that'd be great. Let's see, 1 moment. Whoop. Okay, can you see this? This map?
Yes, there's a little bit of a presenter view over it. Yeah, if you want to click that off, we can see it better. There
Can
it
you
is.
see this now? Okay, amazing. So this is just a little bit of a map of El Puente and our 4 pillars. And you see the different, the organizations that we partner with. And this sort of kind of gives a lay of the land of El Puente and yeah, essentially the projects that we'll be working on. And one of them is this pilot project called the Fazenda de São Sebastião in the Igarapé-Mapia region of Acre, which is the westernmost territory in Brazil, state of Brazil in Acre. And essentially this project was born from our coordination with some of the local stakeholders on the ground. And one of the goals is there's a 4 hectare land here that we're going to be supporting the communities to acquire the title from the government to acquire that land back for their community, these 4 hectares, 3 of which will be used for the reforestation of different of trees and master sacred plants. And one of those hectares will also be reserved for a retreat and dieta center and the creation of the Ethnobotanicals Reserves project that I had mentioned. And I can pass it to Pablo, who can go into more detail around the project. Pablo, do you want to jump in?
Okay. This project is in the Amazon state, just bordering the Acre state in Brazil, and it will serve to create some metrics very useful for all the Amazonian region, especially in these different vectors that Amanda is saying so important for the communities to grow, that are the growing of reserves, the regeneration of them, the education of the local communities and others, and the building up of reciprocity after the reparation that is needed. But for all that, we need some very clear metrics, scientifically proven, etc. And for that, it's good to start small, like El Puente is aiming, and through a process of listening to many other communities and tribes that will help to develop these metrics, not only from the outside view of the old science, but also listening to the locally owned from centuries systems of agroecology or forestry that they have too. Just to say, this is part or a piece of a puzzle of many Amazonian projects that could be developed, that we are studying, first studying and listening really what is the reality of each ecosystem and community, like Amanda was saying, but also with these new technical tools that we are sharing with Open Future, with Treeangle Foundation, as we are going to talk more today, aiming for creating models scalable in quick time at the measure of this decade for regeneration of ecosystem. And that is where we believe with the Friends of El Puente that teacher plants are indeed an accelerator of this process, not only for making people more conscious about these realities, but for making the communities where these are realities, traditional realities, and also heritage, to build up from there the sovereignty, the regeneration, the education, the reciprocity at the level of the need. We will talk more about that. But in this case, in this very little but very big potential project that is in a reserve, in big reserve at a small piece. So when we have the metrics of these 3 to 4 spaces to work, we can scale up and prove also with different communities. This is a hybrid community, intercultural between indigenous, syncretic, Brazilian, but then there are others from different ethnic groups, Queen, Nawa, etc., that could be interesting to develop similar pilot projects to complete a first phase of metrics that then, as said, will be useful for our action in all the Amazon, like many organizations here present. But we are also talking every week or every month from a long time, are aiming to do. That's why we believe this little project is big in the potential, especially when we aim to demonstrate from one side the pillars of El Puente that Amanda is explaining, for the other, the different vectors of this action or grant investment and execution action that Treeangle is bringing as a new frame under development, and especially bringing the new tools to work with all this, like many here present are doing, especially Kaitlin and Jamaica in this amazing open impact platform way of doing. So I don't know, Amanda, if you'd like to retake El Puente horizons from there, but I think that is the importance of this pilot project, that it still needs some support to emerge, but is planned to do in a very short term.
Thanks, Pablo. I think also just to be aware of time, I wanted to leave it here with this pilot project and sort of allow Pablo and Treeangle to take over. So for me, that's our introduction of El Puente. I'll send over also the website and an email address if you're interested to learn more about what we're doing and partake in any of the discussions we'll be having. We'd love to hear from you.
I will just take it from these convergences and being brief. Also, considering that I'm with a very strong COVID today, that's why I miss a lot of the meetings of this very interesting summit. It's difficult for me, but I didn't want to miss it, because for me, this summit that is happening these days is like the top of an iceberg that is emerging, and I really feel and witness that. So my humble contribution in this panel will be more about the Treeangle Foundation way of working with these vectors, and always from a collaborative synergic base as we do, and learning from our experience. In that, I will just refer to 3 basic formulas that we work with. One based in our history. Our history is more coming from 3 mountains, one in the Atlantic rainforest of Brazil, the other in the Andean ecosystem of Argentina, and the other in the Mediterranean ecosystem of Catalonia. And from there, after decades of experience and together with the Institute of Ecotechnics, learning many important lessons there and around the world through demonstrative projects, we believed that was important at the time, 15 years ago, to put the energy in 4 things: creating reserves, regenerating them, re-educating or educating the local communities about these reserves, and research, develop models about it to be able to scale it up. Humbly, we started in these 3 mountains, and then in some of them, they became regional programs or models or initiatives, like in the case of Argentina, in Champaqui Mountain, where we started planting high forest in the watershed of that one special kind of forest that make the watershed of all the big rivers from the Amazon to the Paraná, the polylepis trees. That little project that we used to call Milk in the Clouds started to grow and be replicated in many basins, and started thanks to Acción Andina, a big initiative happening in all the Andes, to become part of the region of more than 100,000 hectares that we are working, and with more indigenous communities of the north. So from there, we take some lessons and compare with the lessons of the other ecosystems of the Atlantic rainforest of our friends from Matutu and from the Sierra da Mantiquera mountains, that they work in big reserves management and forest fire fighting management and brigades, etc., and creation of reserves at high scale with many councils and the government, difficult lessons that we learned there. The same in Catalonia with the Institute of Holistic Research of Montserrat, that Montserrat, the third mountain that initially kicked off Treeangle as a reunion of communities of mountains, that then through experience, we start to apply different projects and develop different initiatives, as said, not only in ecological restoration, but in other fields too, in environmental education especially. And then now we are in the process of, after listening deep realities, not only how to scale up our projects that we are doing, we grow up from planting just thousands of trees to millions of trees, etc., how we can make that long-term self-sustainable cycles, locally owned, etc. All the things that I believe for you also are very important. No? So we developed this what called CRER's approach for these grants and investment systems, that is always to help creating like an ecosystem to develop the capacities of each community or project involved, especially in these 5 vectors that we consider, completely in convergence with El Puente pillars, and of course, with the approach of open future to how we define not only philanthropy, but the regenerative field. Then the first is conservation. We believe conservation not only to create reserves, but to help the communities that have reserves or whatever they have to keep it, to defend them, to have rangers taking care of them, or fence it, or don't permit the logging or mining companies to reinvade indigenous territories already given as reserves, etc. So big part, optimum 1/5 of any help should be given to conserve the reserves in all the ways of conservation, but especially in 3 or 4 are important from the Treeangle perspective. Then the second, and it's very obvious, is the regeneration, not only replanting the forest and the pioneer trees, but all the food and medicines that are required by these regions and communities. So one important part should be going to there upon the standard methods of it, as we do with Acción Andina. And then not only replanting trees, there are 7 or 8 or more ecological restoration procedures that would be good to apply to really restore the capacities of these ecosystems that enter at play, let's say. Then the other vector is education, very obvious for all, but what we are working together with the Institute of Ecotechnics, with Academia Biospherica, and many other partners is new forms of education, how to help both to certify and train the local, sometimes remote communities in running these scaling up projects, but also how to all these curricula can become mainstream, important curricula for the world, whatever indigenous context comes from. Even the Huniquin have amazing methods of forestry that are not yet recognized by the Brazilian register offices of these methods, etc. Things we can help with the education component. That's why the next is research. Not only because research is important and creating models with all that we are doing is important to scale up, as I was saying, but also because scientific monitoring is key. 1 to 3% of everything happening should correspond to the basic standards of research, even if we are jumping to a new paradigm with very different approach. And then at the top of it, we consider that sustainability is important because from each reserve, regenerated, educated, and educating, researched and monitored, we need to sustain it. We need to create a real sustainability in time and space, not the concept of it. And then for that, what we can do, or what they can do, the ones that have their own reserve, have their own teams, they have their own trees and plants planted during the years, etc. They can create their own products and services that can make that self-sustainable without help in the long term of any grant or investment from the outside. So that is to really help in the long term. for that CRERS formula that we can go deeper because there are technological approach, but probably not now. I think later there is also space for that in the day in another panel. Then the last formula I like to finish this approach of Treeangle and partners to this field is the one of common land, friends from Holland and other places that really help in the way also that Amanda explained, to think all this in a way of many kinds of returns, in many kinds of zones and in long cycles. So what in the beginning can be a 10-year of grants for these communities, in the second 10 years probably could become ways of returning, not only in financial, in natural capital, in teams working and inspiration or channels for other products and services to emerge, but also with the possibility of paying it back, even if with carbon, water, with all that they are already producing and having as ecosystemic services. And that way, the bill could be more balanced, no matter if it's a grant, a loan, or a different way of financing. What we are considering is not only a way of doing grants or financing or investing in these communities and reserves, but that sovereignty, that self-sufficiency is so much needed. And this will take, yes, minimum 20 years. This will involve minimum an area of reserve, an area of hybrid crops, houses, and an area of economical development, factories, cities, etc. And yes, it will involve always not only be self-sufficient with finances, but creating more biodiversity, creating more teams, and being an inspiration, a channel of hope for the future to work in these lines. We believe that this is a good base to depart. We are not at the top of it. We are developing together with many partners and really listening to the local realities. And I feel very valuable these encounters to really arrive to the formulations at the level of the circumstances we are passing through. For that, again, we need science and ancestral wisdom hand in hand. And this is our bet and our path with Treeangle and with our friends that are working together. I don't know if there is other questions you would like or aspect you would like to develop more on this approach. I know we are short on time.
Thank you so much, Pablo and Amanda, for sharing. I know that we're going to hand that to Katie here, and we welcome an active chat. So if you do have questions or comments or resources or things that are coming up for you as you hear about these project efforts, we really welcome a chat to keep the conversation lively. Pablo, I think we might be doing questions in a bit, but let's have Katie share a bit about the part that we're supporting you with in this work as well, and then maybe we'll go from there.
Yeah, we should have about 30 minutes of discussion at the end. So thank you so much, Amanda and Pablo, and I'm so honored to be partnering with both of you on this pilot. I'm going to start with a little allegory about Miyawaki forests, which I think Russ Spear on this call in particular will appreciate. In the 1950s, Akira Miyawaki, for those of you who aren't familiar, began work on what would culminate in what he called the Miyawaki method. He learned that by improving the soil of a future forest site using locally available amendments and planting a variety of 50 to 100 local plant species in a random mix and planting them very densely, so 20,000 to 30,000 per hectare compared to a standard 1,000 per hectare, and monitoring, watering, and weeding the site for 2 or 3 years, the resulting trees grow about 10 times faster than with traditional methods. And once stabilized, the forest is able to flourish on its own without further outside intervention. And I'm sharing this because I think the question that brought me here was, what's the most fertile soil into which to plant financial resources? I spent the first part of my career very much in the impact space on kind of the project side, as always kind of seeking the funding, and then found myself in the position as a funder. And I started to realize that we were essentially spacing the trees way too far apart. No matter how much nourishment we threw at them, they still lacked some critical interconnection. It kind of felt like we were throwing resources into a sieve. And that was really the impetus for founding Open Future Coalition. And as Jamaica nodded to earlier, our aim is really to support existing efforts by essentially the strength that's already there. We don't think projects lack capacity. We think the capacity is there, but we sometimes become disconnected from one another and certainly from some of the resources that we need. And so we started our efforts by launching the Open Impact tool that many of you are familiar with and that Pablo mentioned, with tools for non-financial value exchange as a path to what we feel is a more resilient way to pollinate financial value exchange. We think that our best resource is one another. And so just under a year ago, we launched the alpha of the Open Impact platform with 30 organizations in 13 countries, with simple tools for kind of combining process management and community management, starting to look at what happens if we just kind of better start to cross-pollinate our own best practices so that we can start to better see one another. We're now entering the beta phase of the platform, working with 170 organizations in 16 countries. And we're so pleased to be partnering with Puente and Treeangle on the beta, which includes measurement, monitoring, and funding tools to start to model, well, what happens now if you release a financial resource into a richer kind of peer-supported context. And we're applying this through a model that we call Open Future Fund. And the characteristics of that are pretty simple and echo a lot of what Amanda and Pablo already shared, so I'll be brief. We think that these contexts for funding ought to be collaborative, forward learning, long-term, qualitative, participatory, diversified by bioregion and by area of focus. We think that that variation is requisite for the complexity that we need to thrive, and encouraging the local sharing of resources kind of met with the global exchange of knowledge. And so the inquiry when we approach, things like how do we fund agroforestry or reforestation or ecological restoration, we think isn't how cheaply can we plant a tree? Can we shoot it out of the sky with a drone? Can it be $1? Can it be 50 cents? Our question is, what does the tree need? And the resources ought to follow. And so with folks like Amanda and Pablo, we're setting out to kind of pilot this question of what does this more spacious long-term version of funding look like that really puts the project at the center, that really puts that outcome at the center and uses financial and other forms of capital resources as a tool, as sort of a way of enriching that soil. And so the types of tools then that we're piloting in this project really line up with the pillars of Puente and Treeangle. We're looking at one, can we create learning environments as context to better resource one another? Let's not fund a bunch of folks in parallel who are working on similar things so that they can have similar challenges and similar mistakes, but not necessarily benefit from the learning from one another. And so where we've started is, can we ensure that we provide these rich contexts for peer knowledge exchange? And it can be as simple as access to chat or discussion. It can be as simple as the practice. Again, we see technology as a tool or as an extension. It's really kind of the behavior and the way that we design this thing that we think matters. And so can we ensure that we're giving, as a foundation, for example, our whole portfolio of projects better access to one another so that we can ensure that they're able to benefit from those learnings? Not thinking that we know better and can provide the technical assistance that's needed kind of top down, but really recognizing that those who are doing know so much better than anyone else. Next is looking at how do we support peer-to-peer research and kind of the advancement of that knowledge. And so supporting distributed peer review processes like those Academia Biospherica is participating in. But also looking at how do we maintain fidelity and context at scale? Again, monoculture isn't going to get us there. How do we ensure that we're planting the right tree in the right context? How do we learn what's bioregionally appropriate? And so a lot of the models that we're working from are looking at how do we simply, the phase where we're at right now is how do we essentially record that which is already happening and turn that into templates for this worked over here. Wonderful. Let's add that to a repository of global templates. so that someone else can go and take that off the shelf and say, okay, I'm going to try this over here, but be added to a group with everyone else who's using that same template. So they can say, hey, when I do this in step 3, this happens. Are we sure this is how we want to do it? This is what worked for me here. And we can start to complexify these interventions by bioregion and start to learn forward and have these practices adapt forward. And maybe those who started earlier are learning from folks that are more recently along in that process, and they can adapt it for next time. And so really looking at how can we embody living systems design by maintaining context as we scale interventions. And the next is more collaborative approach to metrics. So not punitive or top down, not saying, you know, as a condition of receiving this funding, you need to do this. But really staging conversations between those who are conducting projects and those that are dispersing those funds, and saying, well, what does the project, what does success look to you as a practitioner? And so what I found really fruitful and what's been emerging out of El Puente and Treeangle, for example, is that we're starting to look at metrics from a far broader scope. It's not just I planted this many trees, or, you know, it's we spent this many hours on training and we published this many research articles and we worked with this many different groups or tribes on this project. And we pulled knowledge from here and from here, really focusing on qualitative outcomes, focusing on activities that maintain the longevity of the project and not just the instantiation of it. You know, we did a thing and we left, because that's often the problem too. We'll put a bunch of resources up front in a project and then we don't kind of maintain the capacity over time. And so that's where the next pillar that we find really crucial is ongoing training. Before I get into that, just one more piece on the collaborative metrics. What we think is really important too is kind of a bidirectional dialogue around those metrics. And so not just reporting, I did this, but engaging actively with community members that live near where that project is. And so every metric within our platform has a set of workflows attached to it, whether it's for planting a tree, whether it's for publishing research. It can have its own rules that say, you know, when someone plants a tree, then someone who has the credential of tree planting verifier needs to take a photo and write a comment, or whatever it might be. And we're in a process of a participatory process right now of refining what those standards are metric by metric, by simply sitting with projects right now and recording what they're doing. But the path that we see forward there, we see incredible potential for locally relevant economic incentives as well, tied to the validation of impact, not relying on kind of top-down ratings agencies, but starting to look at, well, how can communities in a sovereign way verify their own impact and at scale have that be counted. And then briefly, that next point was ongoing training. And so we have certain learning management tools, but in particular looking at, let's not just plant the tree, let's ensure that we really focus on looking at kind of ongoing maintenance over time. Let's upskill local leaders. Let's even look at long-term development of financial resilience models. And so that last pillar really is looking at how can we help projects develop their own financial resilience, develop new business models, whether it's by agroforestry or expanding access to multiple forms of funding. And so the last piece I'll share is that we're really focused on deploying the right resources at the right time in the project lifecycle, and doing that in a way that is, again, community stewarded. And so congregating groups of local vetters to identify the projects to fund, rather than having those holding the funds think that they know best necessarily where those funds ought to be deployed. Supporting kind of so we're engaging across a spectrum from philanthropy to investment, although we don't really participate in dilutive forms of investment for projects because we believe that sovereignty is so essential. But even in certain communities where projects might need a loan or a recoverable grant to scale, looking at, well, are there local kind of underwriters or local sort of lending institutions that we can partner with who know so much better than we would what those projects are on the ground that are best to partner with. And so that's very much been our approach on that spectrum, all the way to, if we're already monitoring and measuring the outcomes of these projects for philanthropic purposes, well, gosh, those are a lot of the same measurements that we need to start giving these projects direct market access for things like not just carbon, but other ecosystem services and so forth. And so that's the work that we've been doing. To ground that a little bit, I'm just very briefly going to screen share what we're working on with El Puente. And we're just kicking off the pilot. So the metrics here, I'm afraid to admit, did not go through the full vetting process. These are just some examples, but and I'll share as well, while I share this, that we see, again, this is a way to augment and kind of provide roll-up and transparency to those who are funding to these projects on the ground. We don't necessarily need everyone to be using the same interface. Another thing that we are evolving towards is, SMS, or having a local, one designated person who's associated with the project be the one doing the reporting and trained on the reporting. So that's something we're evolving towards as well. But someone like El Puente can have a space where they can see all of their projects in one place and start to see kind of all of the data and all of the story from those projects roll up, so that they can start to have that better view. And then also put their projects in kind of community with one another. And so this is just an example of the open impact community at large, but you can see here, for example, we're able to see all these different groups, all these different projects. We can just as well set this up just for the portfolio of one foundation or one community or one particular initiative, where folks can start to see, okay, these are the people that are available to volunteer on these projects. These are the other projects I'm here with. And so that we can kind of directly make visible some of these opportunities for engagement, for peer engagement. And then how that peer engagement happens. Here's an example of the Garape Mapia project that Amanda mentioned. And so that project too can have its own profile that can be externally fundable, but just as well from a foundation perspective, for example, we can provide context where the project team can kind of learn with one another. They can have shared calendar, newsfeed, their own task management, kind of things like volunteer hour logging, but also the logging of those impacts. We can have templates for different interventions or trainings. We can kind of bring folks through curricula, and so the curricula they're participating in can show up right here too in the same list. And we can have the training and the research happen within the same context, so that folks can kind of play different roles within that project. And then what this feeds into, this is a very rudimentary version of our dashboard, but we can then start to feed that into full visibility across these spectrums of metrics, right? So how many hectares have we conserved, but also how many project courses, how many researchers have been engaged, how many plants have been preserved. But just as well, simply by allowing folks to log things like their hours, you can start to look at, well, how much time are we spending on this? Let's spend the total funding. And so this is something that we're evolving right now together with partners like El Puente and Treeangle. And really, we're kicking off a group soon among these groups too, to really get into the weeds of what are our challenges in measurement. How can we kind of advance some of these practices together and sort of align across some of these quantitative and qualitative forms of impact measurement. And then the last piece I'll briefly share is that part of this context too, as I'd mentioned, is creating these learning contexts so that we can start to provide space for collaborators to share some of their common challenges, some of their common successes, and evolve some of these practices together over time in the same place that they're doing the measuring, hoping to kind of reduce that burden of administrative grant application processes and so on, so that everything can happen in stride of the act of doing and put all of the energy in the direction of the project and the practitioners rather than the other way around. So that's the overview. I'll stop here. And thank you so much to Pablo and Amanda for being willing to learn with us.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I know it's very rich for those listening. I've been hearing this many times because this is a project we're deeply steeped in, but I hope it was something insightful and interesting for you and get to know a little bit more about the possibilities and know that this is all about open collaboration and partnership. So we're here in service to enable all the incredible work you're doing. And with that, I'm really excited to, really excited to welcome Angela Martinez, who works with the Amazon Defenders Fund. Appreciate you being here today, and we're looking forward to hearing the model that you are working on. So please feel free to share. Thank you so much, Angela.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well, first, I want to acknowledge the place I'm living, which is the unceded Lenape ancestral lands, today known as Brooklyn, New York. I want to acknowledge also the force of my mother and grandmother ancestry from the Efthimiou people. And well, the Amazon Defenders Fund. The Amazon Defender Fund is a solidarity fund of Amazon Watch. And Amazon Watch is an activist organization. Everybody has a long-term relationship with social movements and the Amazon forest. And the Amazon Defenders Funds mobilize solidarity funds to accompany the agenda of the Amazonian people for self-determination and autonomy to protect the Amazon. So the Amazon Defenders Funds mobilize timely and direct, and when I say timely, we mobilize funds in an hour. And direct solidarity funds to the hands of historical and emerging Indigenous movements and organizations, including communities with intersectional identities, for example, women, LGBTQI people, non-Indigenous forest people, quilombolas, and more. Emphasizing accompaniment for communities with less access to resources. It is imperative, since only one, according to the International Funders for Indigenous people, only 1.4% of the global funds go directly to the hands of Indigenous people. So during the Climate Week, I participate in 2 events where donors were questioning their practices to give financial funds to Indigenous people, as they call it. So they emphasize the fact that funds are not given directly to Indigenous peoples, but mainly to intermediaries. They also highlight many practices that are barriers for Indigenous peoples in getting access to these resources. So, however, they didn't touch the point that many of these practices are still under the logic of the capital and under the logic of currency exchange, which reinforce colonial practices. It brought to my mind the first question I have when we established the Amazon Defenders Fund in order to not reproduce colonial practices. And paraphrasing Potawatomi botanist Robin Kimmerer, I asked myself, how can we learn from Indigenous wisdom and ecological systems to reimagine and practice the ethic of reciprocity instead of currencies of exchange in mobilizing funds? So, I want to share my screen. There. See, but can you see that?
We can. It's not in presenter mode though, but we can definitely still see it.
Presenter mode. I'm not very good to do those things. Let me see if I can do it.
Maybe you could just do full.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
There it
we
is.
go.
Thank you, Angela.
You're welcome. So, my question was, yes, what can we learn from Indigenous wisdom and ecological systems? So, and that's why we, the Amazon Defenders Fund is led by the Indigenous movements and by Indigenous principles, cosmovisions, and priorities. And the ethic of reciprocity, which lies at the heart of solidarity. So the Amazonian people of Sarayaku in Ecuador have not seen poverty or scarcity in what they call the causa sacha, which means a living forest. On the contrary, they have found abundance for which they have a respect and responsibility of regenerating life, how to sustain life and enhance its quality. For them, the hegemonic economic system based on fossil fuels and mineral extraction is what have produced scarcity. So the Shipibo Conibo people of the Peruvian Amazon have often told me that the forest is their mercado, food, pharmacy for medicinal plants, and their collective spiritual life space of sharing. So Kimmerer shares with us that most important part of the Potawatomi word, posamin, is min, which means berry, which is also used to call apples, corn, and other fruits. But most importantly, because also is the root of the word give. In the presence of such gifts, gratitude is the first response. The gratitude flows toward our plant elders through the care and respect Indigenous people have for them. So for Kimmerer and many Amazonian people, when we speak of berries, fruits, or medicinal plants, not as things or products or commodities, but as a gift, the whole relationship changes. Gratitude is so much more than a polite thank you. It is the thread that connects us in a deep relationship. If our first response is gratitude, then our second is reciprocity. To give a gift in return. What we can give these plants in return for their generosity. So reciprocity is a high principle for Indigenous people. With their collective work, they reciprocate the land, the rivers, and the forests as a way of gratitude. Thus, they only take what they need and give back. Gratitude and reciprocity so are the currency of a gift economy or regenerative economies, as many Indigenous peoples agree. Nurtures the community bonds, which enhance mutual well-being. And this is why solidarity, respect, reciprocity, and partnership are some of the main principles for the Amazon Defenders Fund. And well, and I just, in respecting these principles, I just want to tell you the ADF, the Amazon Defender Fund, does not have a strict agenda of solidarity. We don't have pillars or themes that we want to accompany. No, our guides are what the Indigenous people need. And it's a broad range of priorities they have. And just as an example, I didn't want to show this graphic, but just very briefly, the majority, for example, in the last fiscal year, solidarity funds went to the issues of community organizing, mobilizing, and strategizing. And that's a lot of the issues that many of our partners mentioned the other donors don't want to accompany. They want to accompany projects with a goal and a result. They don't want to accompany processes. And social change is a process. It's not a project. It's a process. It takes time. And it's different for everybody. So, and when another one, a big area, as you can see, is as defenders at risk. As you might know, Latin America continues being the most dangerous region for defenders of Earth. Since 2012, the Global Witness started reporting the murders and violence against Amazon and defenders of Earth. So, so as I was mentioned to you, we don't have a pillars. We accompany the life plans of our indigenous allies. And their life plans are very holistic. They see life, and they're encompassing in a great amount of activities. So we don't have a restrict agenda. We accompany Amazon people through the whole year. We don't have cycles of grant making, no, through the whole year. And we don't believe in the violence of bureaucracy, because also the violence of bureaucracy is a colonial practice. And we don't believe in that, and we receive their requests, even for a phone call, even for a message in their own language. We don't have a proposal format at all, because the majority of the proposal formats from donors, they have also, it's based in a westernized epistemology. We also mobilize very, very small funds, solidarity funds, and large, from $300 to $100,000. Depends of the process, depends of the movement. And I just want to show you these photos of the last free land camping, the Campamento Terra Libre in Brazil. And we accompany a lot of delegations. This was the largest acampament Terra Libre in Brazil in 18 years. Around 8,000 indigenous people mobilized, and we accompany a great number of delegations to be there. And in this year they have a dialogue with former President Lula da Silva, and also this year to commit him to understand why he thinks about the Amazonian agenda and the indigenous agenda, and also to commit him to these priorities. And this year also a lot of Amazonian women were elected for some political positions. But I just want to show you these slides to see that what we accompany is very broad. And is this important? What is important? Because one of the very important issues that we accompany also is processes of decoloniality and self-governance, the autonomous indigenous governments, because autonomous indigenous governments allow them to manage their forests, the rivers, the soil in the way that they have learned for centuries. And the only way, in another way, is not possible, because as you might know, also there is a lot of extractive activities that violated these collective rights of indigenous people. Well, here you can see also, this is the Chuararutan people. They're protecting their territory to continue regenerating life against mining. And there is a lot of mining boom in the Amazon, because also the transition energy agenda is not really well thought, because it's also using a lot of the minerals and promoting a lot of extraction and a lot of rare minerals. And now in the Amazon, there is a boom of mining in Ecuador, in Brazil. So the Chuararutan people carry out a referendum, and I say no to mining. But still, there have been threat. Actually, a lot of the women dirigentes have been persecuted and threat. They have received a lot of death threats because of that, to protect their self-determination. So we also accompany process of long-lasting change, but also we accompany crises, like for example, the fires in the Amazon, in Bolivia and Brazil, for example, but also we accompany like social mobilizing, like in Ecuador, the 18 strike, the 18 days of strike. They were called by the Indigenous movement. And also we mobilize a lot of our relationships, because also that's important during COVID, because it was a big crisis issue. We mobilize all our relationships in the Amazon so we can accompany our partners. And for example, in regions that they were very hard to reach, we mobilize a lot of financial resources and issues, and we coordinate with local actors. Like for example, in Manaus, we use our colleagues from Greenpeace, use their chips, use their flies, and we mobilize other allies to mobilize the resources and the doctors to save a lot of the lives of what Alexandra Munduruku, a dirigente from Brazil, say. They were their books, because a lot of the elders died during the COVID. And it was a big loss. So we also accompany women-led initiatives, because just as examples of many things we do, but also because there is still a lot of, like Indigenous women say, we cannot decolonize without depatriarchalize. And that's very important. A lot of the Indigenous movement is still very male-dominated. Well, here's, we are accompanying the Coica dirigentes as well in the first gathering they have. And we also accompany a lot of media, but because are also requests from our Indigenous allies, the young people, a lot of media led by Indigenous Amazonian people. But we have a lot of, we also accompany, I heard that you try to mobilize exchange learnings. We accompany what the Amazonian Indigenous people call dialogues of wisdom. And dialogues of wisdom is this learning among Indigenous people from different countries. And they're dealing with same problems, or they're sharing new knowledge. And as you know, they don't see the world with borders, because the Amazonian Indigenous people, the Achanicas, are in Brazil, but also they're in Peru, and they were divided by borders and by the state. And the Wampis in Ecuador, and also in Peru. So that we accompany these also wisdom or dialogues among many other things. So this is the Amazon Defender Songs. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much. One thing that really stands out for me is how much, although we're talking about direct financing and funding, it's also about multi-capital, resourcing. It's about the many kinds of resourcing. And I see such incredible work that you're doing that's about supporting and amplifying and really carrying forth a message so that there's more visibility. And that's such a huge value, along with the work that you're doing to ensure that communities of place have the resourcing and the funding they need to be able to mobilize and to do the work in their own communities. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your incredible work. It's an honor. And we will still have a bit of time for questions, but it's really important to also hear from you, Miriam Volat, with the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. We've invited you today, and we look forward to hearing your presentation as well. And we'll see how much time we have left for any questions at the end. Again, the chat is a wonderful place to dialogue. So thank you so much, Miriam. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. And it's wonderful to get introduced to this platform. And thanks, Amanda, for introducing us. My name is Miriam Volat, and I'm the interim director of the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. And we're a new group. We formed about 2 years ago, and we support biocultural conservation in what we call 5 different keystone biocultures. And we use the ecological term keystone because they're all biocultures where if they sustain the damage from many of the threats that they're under right now, it will undermine big communities and ecosystems. And so the biocultures that we work in are, we call them by a plant or animal name, but we all know that these biocultures are social systems, cultural systems, territories, ecologies, traditional knowledge systems. And so we work with peyote, iboga, ayahuasca or yahe, the toad, or zapo, as it's sometimes called, and then also mushrooms. And we're an Indigenous-led fund in two ways. One is that we actually formed out of requests from people in the communities who asked us to serve as an interface between funders, media, the psychedelic space, and their communities and some of the community-based projects that they were engaged in. And then we're also Indigenous-led in that all of our decision-making about what happens with money, what happens with our community-based assessments, what projects get funded, and all of that all those decisions are made by a conservation committee, is what it's called, that's made up of community representatives from each of the biocultures that we work in. And so, you know, our core mission is to really strengthen Indigenous communities in their efforts to conserve their plant medicines, traditional knowledge, really for their healing and cultural survival. And what we started to find doing some of our early work, and by we, I mean, I'm also the co-director of the River Styx Foundation. And I've worked for about 7 years supporting Native American communities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico with peyote conservation, is that these traditional knowledge ways, the plants, the medicines, and the territories were deeply tied to not only community health, but also the community's ability to defend their rights and to defend their territories. And maybe it seems really obvious to other folks, but for us, it was a real learning journey as philanthropists to, you know, just gain real understanding about the way that these biocultures are highly complex systems, and that all different kinds of parts of it need to be protected. And so, for example, in our work supporting peyote conservation, we found that we were working at a political level, we were working at social and social change levels, we were looking at ecological levels, we were dealing with, you know, rancher and territory relationships, and then also all the issues around youth and language preservation. And so, yeah, so that's where we're working. I'm not sure exactly what folks are most interested in, but I can share that the way that we work is in each of these biocultures, we're engaged in doing what we call community-based assessments, which is essentially, I heard other people talk about this, but listening, and then more listening. And I know when I first came on the call, somebody was talking about taking a pause. And so it's been really interesting as philanthropists, and also being responsible for raising money to support these infrastructure projects, language projects, territory preservation projects, media, and kind of raising Indigenous voices projects, that that we have to do these really incredibly careful community-based assessment processes. And so I think that's something that I would share here that's really, really important. So what we're doing, and each of the biocultures has a very different flavor and a very different approach and a very different way that we do this, but we don't just do, somebody else said this, Angela, I think, we don't take project proposals like in a written form. Everything's about relationships. Everything's about going, delicately and gently into things. Like, for example, in the Amazon, we started with a community-based assessment that was about a 2-year process with the Shipibo Kanivo, which was where we actually had a boat and, went out, and there were youth in the communities who went out and talked to their elders about, just having conversations about in 100 years, for the culture to be really strong, for you to have all your plants and all of your food, and for children to be able to speak their language growing up, what's needed. And part of that was sharing what's happening in the world, talking with the elders. What do you think about this proliferation of people wanting to have, ayahuasca ceremonies in Boston? And what do you think about this, where there's companies who are planning on, making money off of these medicines, and really having these conversations with people and then hearing what was the most important, and then going through a process of actually finding out who was working on the ground, whether they had an organization or not, that needed support, that were doing either territory conservation, language conservation, and then supporting those projects, and really ensuring that the projects that were supported to the best of our ability, one of our principles is do no harm, weren't projects that would then cause other troubles in the community. We are doing long-term support, but not only long-term support. We do short-term support as part of our relationship building. Sometimes that looks like supporting a ceremony or a initiation process. And then all the way to having deeper relationships with organizations where we're making 5, 6, 7, longer term commitments. And our grants are ranging now from like $200 up to $2.5 million, depending on what it is. And we're learning a lot about how to work really differently in the different biocultures. Like, for example, in the Mazatec Sierra in Mexico, in our mushroom bioculture, our assessment process is already 18 months, and it'll probably be another 6 months to a year before we actually support any concrete projects on the ground. And that's because we know that there's been a lot of disruption and confusion and creation of politics that didn't need to be there in the Mazatec Sierra. And so we're just moving very carefully and working with Mazatec people themselves to do that assessment. Whereas like in the peyote bioculture, where things are extremely ecologically urgent, we're deploying a lot of money to secure land and get that land titled to be owned by Native Americans. And then we're supporting a lot of political processes where Native Americans can come into alignment themselves, because there's not necessarily that alignment, and that's been asked to support those governance processes. So one of the things that we're definitely learning is that supporting good process and supporting governance process and supporting people on the ground being engaged in governance processes, one of the key strategies. So I'd share governance, securing territory, and language and traditional culture passing are some of the 3 areas that we're finding need support across the board. Our fund is committed about 20 million over the next 3.5 years to these efforts, but we're looking to bring in more funds from both the psychedelic space as benefit sharing. A couple of people have mentioned this. We believe that the psychedelic space, in order to be successful in addressing some of the mental health and disconnection concerns of mainstream society, if they don't engage in benefit sharing and ensure that these biocultures don't suffer, essentially that the psychedelic industry doesn't become another extractive industry like mining and deforestation, that it won't really be successful in alleviating trauma anyways. And so we're looking at bringing in a lot more what we call benefit sharing dollars to support that. An example of that would be that if people are familiar with the plant Iboga tabernathi, which is native in Gabon and is used for the ibogaine, and has been used over the last 10 years very successfully to address opiate use disorders and PTSD, mostly with a lot of vets. That in that last 10 years, one of the things we've seen in our assessment is that the Bwiti and other people who utilize Iboga traditionally in their initiation ceremonies are not being able to access that medicine at all in the way that they have in the past, that it's become another poached plant in the same areas where elephants are poached. It's caused a lot of violence. And so that's an example of places where we're really putting our efforts and work. One of the outcomes that we've seen there is we've been supporting a process of having the Gabonese government actually utilize the Nagoya Protocol, and the Gabonese government now has regulations in place, and local plantations are now able to grow and export Iboga on their own terms and get benefits from that. And so that's an example of some of the kind of processes that we're supporting. But Iboga is just one example. All of these biocultures are under not only pressure from climate change and the regular extractive industries that we are used to trying to alleviate and mitigate damages from, but also from the psychedelic industry. So
Miriam, thank you so much for all this. I wanted to note we want to leave a little time for questions, but I think it's so incredibly important, this incredible body of work for protection, conservation, and particularly the community assessment. The way that you're approaching it from that deep listening is so essential. The respect of cultural knowledge and understanding and the complexities of place. So any other final thoughts on that? And then we're going to go ahead and open that up to let a little bit of questions come from this rich share that's been happening today. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. That's what we're doing. We've got about 24 projects right now, and we have another suite of projects rolling out in the beginning of next year. Part of what this takes, I will say, since I think we're talking about philanthropy, is we do need to have technical teams on the ground. And so that's a whole learning curve too, is that kind of bridge making function and sort of best practices there. And that's something that is a really rich discussion.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And any resources that you can put in the chat as well. I think that part of this is an opportunity to be learning forward together. I don't know that anybody's solved or cracked the cookie, or a lot of these issues would be handled. And so there's this opportunity, I think, to recognize how we can better collaborate and partner, and by understanding what is successful and effective and where people are having, seeing growth and support for these regions and for these plants and for these bioregions and for these peoples. I also know there's a lot that we're challenged by and that we're learning, we're trying to figure out together. And I think the cooperation and the ability to say, how can we best learn forward, is essential at this time. I don't think any one organization or effort or fund is going to be able to do it all alone. We have to figure out how to be way more cooperative. So please do share some resources in the chat. with the additional amount of time, I feel like there's been a lot of bubbling in the chat as well, and welcoming any questions. You can either raise your hand or sort of wave at me with your camera on, and I'll see if we can get a couple of voices in before we wrap for today's session. Thank you. We're just digesting. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Pablo, go ahead.
I think there is one point that is interesting to consider when talking as much about funding and financing these very different local realities. That it's not that I have it clear, but I think that is important to discuss. That is, it's not only the capitalism the only option, and it's not only the communism is antagonism. There is a third place, or there is another place that when we are having these discussions, or when Katie is saying money is just a tool to do this, I think we are then arriving to another conception of these financial resources, and also, of course, to the edge of another historical phase that way. So I call and I hope we can discuss more the frameworks of the systems we are working, and also to find a middle path. If not, we will repeat the battle in one way or the other, whatever black and white is at place, no? Capitalism and communism, indigenous, non-indigenous, etc. And I think same with best practices and local realities. It's not only, yes, very important to listen deeply all the local realities, but if we don't have a comparable tool with science or with best practices, also we will repeat same gaps one way or the other. That is a challenge to have in, I think, philosophical terms, but also in very much more practical terms, the tools we use. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. I see David, and then Miriam, I see your hand again, and we'll probably wrap for today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm struck by the climate refugee situation that's going on in certain countries, get more media attention and get more empathy from the global community for things that need to happen. And it's not necessarily what the media puts their focus on as the highest priority. There might be a rainforest burning down in a particular village that has plants that will go extinct if they don't get saved. So I appreciate what I heard earlier, Angela saying about, we can deploy funds in an hour. And that's a stark contrast to doing research over several months or several years of time. Some of the things feel incredibly urgent. So I'm really curious, how do we gather as a community around prioritizing situations that if they don't get resourced immediately, like if we don't protect this place from cattle grazing, which is about to go, and it shouldn't just be the indigenous people on the ground saying stop and holding up, steins to say stop. It needs to be some other way, whether it's, conserving the land or something. I'm just curious, how do we move to protect things in places that need to be protected and get them on the radar of the larger community faster? And part of even the platform design that we're talking about, Kaitlin and Jamaica and this whole thing you're doing, that somewhere in the architecture of the tech needs to be a way to have almost like you get on your cell phone, like if a child is picked up, everybody gets alerted on their phone. There's a child that's been picked up in my state. What do we do to make sure everybody's watching out for that child? What do we do to make sure everyone's watching out for that bird or that indigenous plant or that the tree, the redwood is about to be cut down? How do we have sort of an alert system that gets everyone's attention quickly to respond, almost as it is an emergency? It's like we just need to see more than human life as being worthy of that kind of emergency response.
Thank you for that, David. I will say that there are some of that. I mean, things like the WhatsApp and Signal groups, I'm on several where there are some emergency global response alliances. That doesn't mean that they're as wide known as they need to be, but I do see that the rippling of the beginnings of trying to have more of that SOS communication to help mobilize together. And, you know, later today, we have a session at 2 o'clock on cooperative strategies for leveraging media and storytelling to drive action and engagement. And in that space are people who are actively working on how do we tell these more compelling stories to drive engagement, and what are those strategies to cooperating to sort of amass greater efforts to drive some of these stories and data to more people. How do we amplify essentially the message by being cooperative across campaigns and media efforts versus, you know, trying any one organization or effort or initiative or alliance to go it alone. So I will acknowledge that it's not solved, but that you're on point with something that a lot of folks are also looking at, how we get way more coordinated. On that, we are about time for 9:30. I do see a couple of hands. Maybe if they could be offered as quick sentiments, then we can go ahead and close this particular session out, and we'll open the demonstration roundtable. 3T, did you want to share something quickly, Ricardo, and then we're going to go ahead and close the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So here I am in Puerto Rico in a tropical rainforest setting where we have a sustainable forestry project, and I think a lot of this discussion does revolve around land in South America. And we do actually, you know, a lot of the psychedelic world is North America and Europe. And Puerto Rico, as a territory of the United States, has a lot of secondary forest that is considered to be wasteland. The historical use of Puerto Rico under its colonial leaders, as it were, has led to almost a complete abandonment of caretaking of the land. Very little land in Puerto Rico is protected land, considered protected, which is like 16% of the island only is protected. Anyway, I just see that you know, there's a lot more that can be done with. We are working with endemic plant propagation and surveys for all the very endangered species on our land. But I'm also keeping a small, you know, secret ethnobotanical reserve here with a few species. But, you know, Puerto Rico is a place that could be considered for various tropical reserves of things. I'm just thinking out loud, but, you know, just bear it in mind that it's not just like lands where there are indigenous people, that, you know, Puerto Rico has had a history of colonial, you know, whatever that word is, but it's here, and there's a lot of land that needs to be protected, and that land, which is a lot of secondary forest, could be used for this type of work to have reserves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Treaty. Yeah, and I think that's a big part. We're just kicking off the day, and today we're only going to get through as many sessions as we can. We have to be human at some point here, but there's many sessions set up today to continue these important dialogues and look at this from different angles, both from the role of restoration work and what it does to help calm and cool the planet and start restoring the biodiversity and the cascading benefits that come, to all the way to things like land stewardship and reciprocity and sovereignty and restoring a planetary relationship at the end of the day today. So join us for those continuing conversations and also bodies of work and action. Thank you for everybody. I do want to let Ricardo share just briefly, and then we are going to officially close the session and open it up because a bunch of folks are jumping in to hear about these demonstration projects and understand what's happening on the ground and what are the, you know, what are the bodies of work happening. But we'll go ahead and let you, Ricardo, share one last thought, and then we're going to go ahead and end the session for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamaica. Hi, everyone. I'll go down directly to the point. Often we notice that in fora like these ones, when we discuss extractive businesses and solutions, there is always something that is really absent, the elephant in the room. And I'm coming from the point of view of someone who works for the last 20 years in the Colombian Amazon rainforest, which is production monocultures of coca for the alkaloid cocaine. That's a multi-million-dollar business. 70% of the profits stay in the global north. Nevertheless, most of our allies never address the issue. And I think that's really, really important. We need to problematize production of coca and cocaine if we are concerned about the Colombian Amazon rainforest, but also the Brazilian and the Peruvian and the Bolivian. So just wanted to point that out, and we'll leave it at that right now. And thank you so much for the space.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo, so much. you've just opened up something that's so dynamic and rich, and we're going to just cap it there and note that there's much to do and consider and look at. And we're going to still acknowledge this particular session and thank all the panelists. Thank you for everybody who's presented your models for direct financing and funding and multi-capital resource and support and amplification, uplifting, protection, preservation and encouragement of sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and local territories. And there's just so much richness that was shared this morning. And I deeply appreciate your work and thank you for coming to share with this global community today. Please do put your information in the chat so people can follow up with you and include any calls to action that you have, any particular needs that you have. I think that's really relevant to allow this to be a co-resourcing moment, even as so many of you are looking to resource these communities and these territories. So with that, I am going to officially end this session. I'll stop the recording and thank everybody for participating. And I will encourage to stick around for the next session, which we're going to kick off right away, which is a global roundtable of demonstration projects in eco-restoration. Obviously, all of you have been added to the calendar. We have a whole series of conversations all day today. So come back and join us if you are leaving now. And thank you for being here now.